The music press routinely romanticizes the premature collapse of young artists, aggressively packaging them as tortured, melancholic dreamers. Yet, behind the final breakdown of Joy Division's 23-year-old frontman, Ian Curtis, lies the chilling, systemic apathy of an entire collective. What happens when a vocalist collapses into violent epileptic convulsions on stage, only for the audience and management to applaud, mistaking a live medical emergency for avant-garde choreography? Why did his own bandmates actively ignore explicit distress signals just to protect a lucrative touring schedule? This is the ruthless reality of an industry that stood by and watched a human being biologically deteriorate, only to posthumously brand his unmanaged agony as a masterpiece. The history of the modern music industry is built on a foundation of manufactured rebellion and carefully constructed myths. In the late 1970s, the entertainment machine was actively searching for the next subcultural phenomenon to commodify following the commercial collapse of mainstream punk. In the severe industrial decay of Manchester, promoters and record executives found a highly marketable asset in Joy Division. The band spearheaded the emerging post-punk movement, presenting a darker, more cynical sonic architecture that perfectly mirrored the economic depression of the era. At the center of this commercial enterprise was Ian Curtis, a frontman who quickly became the focal point of the British music press. Journalists and critics from prominent publications like NME and Melody Maker descended on the city to document this lucrative new wave. They observed the frontman on stage and immediately projected their own pretentious artistic narratives onto his erratic, unpredictable physical movements. The media widely described his stage presence as a mesmerizing physical manifestation of working-class alienation and urban decay. Reviewers routinely praised his violently jerking limbs and fixed stares as he ultimate display of performative art and raw emotion. The industry effectively branded him as a tormented visionary, channeling the collective rage of a disenfranchised, unemployed youth demographic. This media-driven romanticization created a highly profitable illusion that completely masked a severe biological crisis occurring in real time. When investigators strip away the poetic rhetoric of the music press and examine the archival footage through a strict clinical lens, a much darker reality emerges. Medical professionals and forensic neurologists do not see a choreographed dance of existential dread when they review those early performance tapes. They observe a central nervous system in a state of catastrophic distress and a body losing basic motor function. The violent, sudden movements that critics hailed as artistic genius were, in strict medical terms, involuntary myoclonic jerks. Myoclonus is characterized by sudden, uncontrollable muscle spasms caused by an abnormal discharge of electrical activity in the brain's cortex. In the context of the frontman's specific and escalating neurological condition, these were not isolated tics or theatrical choices. These localized spasms functioned as the pre-ictal aura, the immediate biological precursor and warning system to a full-blown grand mal seizure. The electrical misfires were visibly spreading across his neural pathways, preparing to hijack and shut down the entire nervous system. The audience, the critics, and the venue promoters were not witnessing an avant-garde performance. They were actively cheering during a live medical emergency. The sheer physical exertion required to front a touring rock band compounded the severity of these unmanaged neurological events. A grand mal, or tonic-clonic seizure, demands a massive expenditure of metabolic energy, leaving the patient in a state of profound post-ictal exhaustion. Instead of receiving immediate medical intervention, emergency oxygen, or secure recovery PBOAB oxygen, the patient was expected to keep the commercial show running. The paying crowds demanded the very spectacle that was biologically destroying him night after night across the United Kingdom. The music industry normalized this physiological collapse, seamlessly converting severe neurological trauma into rapid ticket sales and critical acclaim. The socio-economic environment of late 1970s Manchester allowed a life-threatening medical condition to be seamlessly disguised as entertainment. The city was suffering from aggressive deindustrialization, widespread labor strikes, high unemployment, and a rapidly decaying urban infrastructure. This harsh environment cultivated a specific brand of hypermasculinity among working-class men, where physical endurance and emotional suppression were heavily enforced. Complaining about chronic illness, physical pain, or mental instability was socially penalized and viewed as a fundamental flaw in character. Young men were conditioned to internalize their suffering entirely, viewing silent endurance as a mandatory trait for survival in a brutal economic climate. This toxic stoicism dictated the internal dynamics of the local music scene and isolated anyone dealing with underlying health issues. Within this localized culture, seeking professional medical help or publicly discussing a chronic neurological disorder was deeply stigmatized. Epilepsy in particular still carried heavy societal prejudices in the UK during this era, often erroneously associated with unreliability in the blue-collar workforce. For an aspiring musician desperately trying to secure a recording contract, disclosing a debilitating illness was viewed as a career-ending liability. Consequently, the frontman was forced to actively hide the escalating severity of his condition from managers, booking agents, and the press. The burden of maintaining this public facade required an immense psychological toll that ran parallel to the rapid physical deterioration. He operated in an environment completely devoid of an occupational health framework, basic safeguarding protocols, or union protection. The local gig circuit consisted of damp, poorly ventilated basements, working men's clubs, and makeshift venues with highly hazardous electrical setups. These environments were inherently dangerous for a healthy individual, but for a patient with a volatile seizure disorder, they were actively hostile zones. Yet the unwritten rules of the Manchester entertainment scene dictated that the show must continue regardless of personal risk or visible physical injury. This deliberate misinterpretation by the media severed the crucial link between the patient and the grim reality of his illness. When thousands of paying customers are applauding your clinical symptoms, it creates a powerful psychological dissonance that heavily complicates medical acceptance. The patient is financially and socially rewarded for ignoring his body's critical warning signs and pushing his nervous system into the red zone. Acknowledging the illness meant halting the momentum of the band, losing the primary income stream, and breaking the illusion the press had meticulously constructed. The choice forced upon him was between prioritizing essential medical care or fulfilling the aggressive demands of a newly acquired, demanding audience. Fans and bootleg reviewers eventually coined ignorant terms like the dead fly dance to describe the frontman's signature stage movements. This terminology perfectly encapsulates the morbid commodification of his clinical symptoms by a detached, entertainment-hungry consumer base. The erratic flailing of arms, the sudden snapping back of the neck, and the disorganized footwork were directly mapped to specific neurological failures. When the temporal lobe experiences an abnormal electrical surge, motor control is abruptly hijacked, overriding any conscious attempts to choreograph movement or maintain balance. The supposed dance was SC, imply the visible tragic manifestation of a human brain struggling to maintain equilibrium before a catastrophic systemic shutdown. The failure of bystanders to recognize these explicit distress signals highlights a systemic ignorance deeply embedded within the live entertainment sector. If a factory worker collapsed on an assembly line with similar symptoms, strict industrial safety protocols would mandate an immediate medical evaluation. However, the concert stage operates under a completely different set of arbitrary rules, where extreme physical distress is routinely categorized as theatrical commitment. Security personnel and stage managers were trained exclusively to control crowds and protect equipment, not to monitor the vital signs of the performers. The entire live music apparatus functioned with zero medical oversight, leaving vulnerable individuals entirely unprotected during highly dangerous physiological episodes. This severe lack of infrastructure forced the frontman into a state of profound medical isolation, despite being constantly surrounded by audiences and industry personnel. The prevailing macho culture of Northern England ensured that even when the symptoms were undeniable, they were met with awkward silence rather than clinical intervention. Peer groups of young men in this specific demographic lacked the vocabulary, the education, and the emotional capacity to manage a chronic, life-threatening disease. They possessed no training in basic first aid, no understanding of seizure triggers, and no viable strategy for managing a chronic patient on the road. The default operational strategy was simply to look away, hope the episode passed quickly, and pretend it never happened once the patient regained consciousness. This willful blindness created an impenetrable wall between the reality of the disease and the narrative sold to the public. The industry actively constructed a lucrative mythology around a tortured genius. They sold posters of the boding artist, actively ignoring the terrified young man waking up bruised on a concrete dressing room floor. Acknowledging his medical reality meant halting a massive income stream. So the label chose the mythology. This normalization of trauma extended far beyond the immediate music industry executives and seeped directly into the fan culture itself. Audiences began arriving at venues specifically expecting to see the frontman lose physical control, viewing the medical episodes as the thrilling climax of the set list. The ethical line between a musical performance and a morbid public spectacle completely evaporated during these heavily promoted early tours. Fans were inadvertently funding and demanding the continuous biological degradation of the very person they claimed to idolize and support. The commercial transaction at the venue door effectively bought the audience the right to witness a young man's central nervous system tear itself apart. The live music environment was meticulously designed to extract maximum cultural capital while offering zero infrastructural or medical support. The romanticized narrative provided a convenient legal shield, allowing the management team and the audience to collude in maintaining a highly profitable fiction. The industry actively demanded severe suffering as proof of authenticity, perfecting the unchecked exploitation of a chronic condition. Under strict forensic scrutiny, the root of this collapse is not found in an abstract artistic curse, but in specific weaponized environmental triggers. Medical records confirmed a highly specific and volatile condition, photosensitive epilepsy. Medical records confirmed a highly specific and volatile condition, photosensitive epilepsy. This diagnosis transformed standard concert venues into highly active biological hazard zones for the frontman. In this specific variant of the disorder, intense visual stimuli bypass conscious processing and directly assault the brain's visual cortex. Rapidal. Eye-flashing lights trigger synchronized electrical discharges across neural pathways, forcefully overriding the body's motor control. The standard equipment of late 1970s rock concerts was essentially weaponized against his central nervous system. The primary catalyst for these violent neurological events was the standard strobe light. Booking agents and tour managers considered strobe rigs essential for generating a chaotic, high-energy atmosphere in cramped, dark clubs. For a patient with photosensitivity, a strobe light flashing at specific frequencies acts as an immediate neurological trigger. The rapid oscillation between extreme brightness and total darkness overloads the optic nerve in fractions of a second. This sensory bombardment guarantees a grand mal seizure with terrifying mathematical predictability. The most glaring intersection of medical negligence and commercial greed occurred at the Rainbow Theatre in London during November 1979. The band was booked to support the Buzzcocks, placing them in front of their largest and most aggressive audience yet. Venue promoters utilized an overwhelming high-intensity strobe lighting rig designed to disorient the crowd and heighten the abrasive punk aesthetic. As the flashing lights hit the stage, the frontman's neurological defenses immediately collapsed under the severe optical assault. He suffered a massive grand mal seizure mid-performance, collapsing heavily onto the stage floor in front of thousands of people. Paramedics were not stationed at the venue, and no emergency medical protocols were in place to secure his airway or prevent physical trauma. The patient was left convulsing violently on the hard wooden floor, vulnerable to severe head injuries and respiratory distress. Following this highly public and dangerous medical emergency, basic occupational safety protocols demanded an immediate overhaul of the stage design. Standard procedure should have dictated the permanent removal of all strobe equipment for future contracts and venue riders. Instead, the management explicitly refused to alter the lighting configurations, calculating that the visual spectacle was too valuable to the band's brand. The decision to retain the strobe lights establishes a clear, documented timeline of corporate negligence overriding basic human survival. Venue managers and tour promoters prioritized ticket sales and aesthetic impact over a verified, life-threatening medical hazard. The frontman was continually pushed back onto stages that were rigged to systematically trigger his neurological collapse. He was effectively forced to navigate a sensory minefield night after night to fulfill the commercial obligations of the tour. The live entertainment machine actively chose to maintain a deadly working environment rather than compromise its aggressive visual product. While the physical environment of the concert stage was hostile, the internal chemical environment constructed by his medical practitioners was equally destructive. An examination of the clinical history, heavily corroborated by records detailed in the biographical account Touching from a Distance, reveals a catastrophic pharmacological regimen. General practitioners in the late 1970s lacked specialized understanding of complex rapid-onset seizure disorders. In young, highly active adults, they resorted to outdated, heavy-handed pharmaceutical interventions designed to chemically subdue the nervous system rather than effectively manage the specific triggers. The patient was essentially used as a trial and error testing ground for highly toxic chemical combinations. The cornerstone of this flawed treatment protocol was the prescription of phenobarbital, a powerful barbiturate used as an anticonvulsant. Phenobarbital operates by aggressively depressing the entire central nervous system to prevent the electrical misfires that cause seizures. While it can reduce the frequency of convulsions, the chemical toll on the human brain is devastating and cumulative. The drug induces profound crippling lethargy, severe cognitive impairment, and acts as a massive chemical catalyst for clinical depression. The treatment effectively locked the patient in a state of permanent exhaustion, severely compromising his ability to process basic emotions. The side effects of this heavy barbiturate regimen directly collided with the relentless physical demands of fronting a touring rock band. The chemical depression induced by the phenobarbital was severe enough to require its own aggressive medical intervention. To counteract the crushing psychological weight of the anticonvulsant, doctors prescribed a secondary layer of medication. The patient was introduced to tricyclic antidepressants, a class of medications that fundamentally alter serotonin and norepinephrine levels in the brain. This decision created a lethal pharmacological paradox that rapidly accelerated his physical and mental deterioration. Tricyclic antidepressants carry a severe and widely documented contraindication for patients suffering from active seizure disorders. These specific psychiatric medications chemically lower the neurological threshold required to trigger a full-blown seizure. The patient was trapped in an impossible biological loop engineered entirely by his prescribed treatment plan. The epilepsy medication forced his brain into a state of severe clinical despair. Simultaneously, the medication prescribed to treat that depression actively stripped away his neurological defenses, guaranteeing more frequent and violent seizures. This lethal chemical cocktail completely destabilized his brain chemistry, rendering any baseline level of health impossible to achieve. Instead of stabilizing the patient, the medical intervention created a vicious cycle of escalating neurological and psychological emergencies. Each new seizure required a higher dose of heavy barbiturates to control the electrical storms in his cortex. The increased barbiturate dosage deepened the chemical depression, which in turn demanded higher doses of dangerous tricyclics. The patient's central nervous system was being systematically dismantled by the very pharmaceutical tools deployed to save him. A responsible medical intervention would have demanded an immediate cessation of all touring activities to monitor this volatile drug combination. Adjusting heavy psychiatric and neurological medications requires a stable, highly controlled environment and constant clinical observation. The patient needed a secure setting free from severe sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and irregular dietary habits. Instead, the management team and record label completely ignored the escalating severity of his pharmacological crisis. They demanded the patient maintain a grueling schedule of nightly performances, endless travel, and high-pressure recording sessions. The logistics of an independent UK tour in 1979 involved driving hundreds of miles overnight in freezing, uninsulated transit vans. The band survived on terrible diets, sleeping on equipment cases, and existing entirely outside of normal circadian rhythms. This extreme physical deprivation is the absolute worst possible environment for a patient attempting to manage a severe seizure disorder. Sleep deprivation is a primary, universally recognized trigger for epileptic events. Completely overriding the protective effects of any medication, the tour schedule essentially weaponized exhaustion, guaranteeing that the chemical barriers holding back the seizures would inevitably fail. Furthermore, the social reality of the touring circuit involved heavy exposure to alcohol, which fundamentally disrupts anticonvulsant medications. Even moderate alcohol consumption interferes with the liver's ability to metabolize barbiturates, leading to toxic buildups or sudden drops in pharmacological efficacy. The chaotic backstage environment offered zero stability, making it impossible to adhere to a strict medication schedule. Doses were missed, delayed, or taken on an empty stomach after hours of grueling travel and brutal sound checks. The biological foundation required to keep the patient stable was completely destroyed by the basic operational mechanics of the tour. As the heavy medications failed to prevent the seizures, the sheer physical trauma of the convulsions began to accumulate. A grand mal seizure involves violent, uncontrolled muscle contractions that can tear ligaments, dislocate joints, and cause severe bruising. The patient was frequently thrown to concrete floors, slamming his head against microphone stands, drum risers, and monitor wedges. There was no recovery period allocated after these brutal physical traumas. The van simply rolled to the next city the following morning. The management expected a battered, concussed individual to stand up, swallow his toxic chemical cocktail, and perform again within 24 hours. The complete lack of medical supervision on the road meant there was no objective party to hit the brakes. Tour managers are employed to ensure the band arrives at the venue, and the promoter hands over the cash. They are not trained medical professionals, nor are they financially incentivized to cancel a lucrative string of sold-out shows. The operational directive was clear. Keep the fragile frontman upright long enough to complete the set list and fulfill the contract. The rapid biological collapse of the primary asset was simply factored in as the cost of doing business in the independent music sector. This relentless pressure cooker environment fundamentally altered the patient's perception of his own physical value. When the surrounding corporate structure consistently prioritizes the performance over the medical emergency, the patient internalizes that toxic hierarchy. He began to view his own debilitating illness merely as a logistical inconvenience to the band's rising commercial trajectory. The crushing guilt of potentially derailing his friends' careers forced him to mask the extreme side effects of the lethal drug loop. He was entirely isolated inside his own failing body, silenced by the unrelenting momentum of the entertainment machine. The intersection of intense strobe lighting, toxic pharmacology, and brutal tour logistics created an inescapable death trap. The medical records and tour itineraries from late 1979 to early 1980 outline a clear, undeniable trajectory of systemic failure. The patient was not just battling a chronic neurological disease, he was fighting a multi-front war against gross industrial negligence. Every element of his professional environment was actively configured to accelerate his physical and mental destruction. The diagnosis of epilepsy did not seal his fate. The deliberate, profit-driven refusal to accommodate that diagnosis is what finalized the medical sentence. The operational framework of factory records is often romanticized as a triumph of independent artist-first ethics. In reality, the label functioned as a highly efficient machine designed to circumvent standard corporate liabilities. Manager Tony Wilson established a strict ideological policy of operating entirely without formal, written recording contracts. He publicly sold this concept as a revolutionary rejection of the manipulative mainstream music industry and its oppressive legal jargon. However, under strict forensic scrutiny, This handshake agreement model reveals a calculated strategy to completely eliminate the company's duty of care. In standard United Kingdom labor law, a formal employment contract legally binds a company to protect the health and safety of its workers. By refusing to draft these legal documents, Wilson effectively stripped the band members of all occupational protections. The frontman was not classified as an employee, rendering him entirely ineligible for employer-sponsored health insurance or specialized medical support. There were no provisions for paid sick leave, disability compensation, or legally mandated recovery periods following severe neurological events. The record label secured the freedom to infinitely exploit the artist's output while successfully shielding itself from any legal or financial fallout. This deliberate legal void meant that when the medical emergencies escalated, the financial burden fell entirely on the patient. The frontman was navigating a catastrophic health crisis without any corporate safety net to catch him. If the seizures permanently incapacitated him, factory records held absolutely no legal obligation to finance his long-term medical care. The label could simply walk away from a broken human asset without facing a single lawsuit or paying a legal settlement. This asymmetrical power dynamic forced the severely ill singer to keep generating revenue just to survive his own escalating medical bills. The narrative of a rock band often relies heavily on the illusion of an unbreakable brotherhood navigating the industry together. Investigative reality, however, exposes a much colder dynamic driven by financial desperation and gross medical ignorance among the peer group. Bassist Peter Hook and guitarist Bernard Sumner were young working-class men completely unequipped to manage a complex neurological disorder. They lacked the most basic first aid training required to secure an airway or protect a seizing patient from cranial trauma. Instead of seeking professional education on epilepsy, the collective chose deliberate, willful ignorance as their primary coping mechanism. This collective apathy manifested in shocking displays of physical neglect during the grueling national tours. When the frontman suffered violent grand mal seizures in transit, the immediate response was not to divert to a hospital. Band members routinely resorted to physically restricting his convulsing body by forcing him into a heavy sleeping bag. They would zip him inside to contain the violent thrashing and simply leave. Him isolated in the back of the freezing equipment van. The rest of the touring party would then walk into the nearest pub to drink, leaving a critically vulnerable patient entirely unmonitored. Waking up from a grand mal seizure is a terrifying process characterized by severe confusion, amnesia, and deep physiological panic. The medical term for this recovery phase is the post-ictal state, requiring calm reassurance and immediate neurological assessment. Instead, the frontman would regain consciousness, trapped inside a zipped sleeping bag, isolated in the dark, freezing rear compartment of a commercial vehicle. He awoke entirely alone, struggling to breathe through the heavy fabric, with his muscles severely bruised from the unmitigated convulsions. This repeated trauma reinforced a devastating psychological reality. His life held absolutely no value to the operation beyond his ability to hold a microphone. The justification for this brutal treatment was rooted entirely in the harsh financial realities of the independent circuit. In his later memoir, Unknown Pleasures, Peter Hook explicitly admitted that the band actively chose to look the other way. Acknowledging the extreme severity of the illness would have mandated a complete halt to the touring schedule. Canceling shows meant immediate forfeiture of venue guarantees, cutting off the only revenue stream, keeping the musicians out of poverty. They calculated that ignoring a dying friend was the necessary price for maintaining their fragile upward commercial trajectory. While the band ignored the medical reality, the management team actively weaponized the illness for public relations. Tony Wilson recognized that the dark, erratic nature of the frontman's condition aligned perfectly with the post-punk aesthetic. He did not attempt to shield the singer's public breakdown. He framed it as an authentic display of tortured genius. The seizures and the subsequent chemical lethargy were pitched to journalists as tangible proof of the band's uncompromising artistic depth. The management effectively transformed a life-threatening disability into a highly lucrative marketing tool for the Factory Records catalog. This commercial exploitation extended aggressively into the controlled environment of the recording studio. Producer Martin Hannett was notorious for his dictatorial methods and obsessive pursuit of an isolated mechanical sound. When the band entered the studio to record, the frontman was heavily sedated under toxic doses of phenobarbital. The barbiturate stripped him of his natural vocal cadence, leaving him severely lethargic, emotionally detached, and struggling with cognitive processing. Rather than halting the sessions to allow the patient to recover, Hannett recognized this chemically induced paralysis as an exploitable asset. Hannett aggressively manipulated the singer's medicated state using state-of-the-art studio technology. He relied heavily on the AMS-DMX15-80S, an early digital delay and pitch shifting unit, to process the raw vocal tracks. The producer fed the frontman's exhausted, flat vocal deliveries through the machine to create eerie, disembodied sonic textures. He artificially widened the sound, adding harsh metallic delays that perfectly captured the feeling of total psychological isolation. Hannett wasn't trying to capture the soul of the artist. He was mechanically extracting the sound of a nervous system shutting down. Hannett's ruthless pursuit of the perfect sound meant he actively demanded takes when the singer was visibly nearing physical collapse. There are documented studio sessions where the frontman was physically unable to support his own weight due to the heavy barbiturate load. Hannett simply instructed the studio assistants to prop him up against the microphone stand and hit the record button. The producer demanded compliance from a patient who lacked the cognitive capacity to legally or functionally consent to the working conditions. This Siurstarskew crosses the line from eccentric artistic direction directly into the territory of gross workplace abuse and physical exploitation. The resulting vocal tracks became the defining, critically acclaimed signature of the Joy Division sound. Reviewers praised the chilling, detached vocal delivery without understanding they were listening to a man drowning in heavy anticonvulsants. Hannett successfully turned the genuine, horrific emotional numbness caused by the medical mismanagement into an innovative audio landscape. The producer completely ignored the human cost, focusing solely on engineering a record that would dominate the independent charts. The studio was not a creative sanctuary. It was an extraction facility where a patient's biological decay was pressed into vinyl. Throughout this entire process of recording and touring, not a single individual within the professional apparatus intervened. Sound engineers, booking agents, label executives, and fellow musicians all witnessed the rapid physical deterioration firsthand. They watched a young man struggle to stand up in the vocal booth and saw him convulsing violently in the dirt outside venues. Yet, the collective consensus was always to push him towards the next microphone or the next stage. The machinery of the music business operated with total impunity, entirely insulated from the ethical implications of its actions. This absolute failure of the collective highlights a profound systemic cruelty built into the foundation of the entertainment industry. The system demands that the primary asset continues to generate capital until it reaches the point of total structural failure. There was no human resources department to file a grievance with, no union representative to mandate a medical evaluation, and no legal recourse. The frontman was completely surrounded by people who relied on him for their own professional success and financial stability. His utility to the collective drastically outweighed his right to basic medical survival, sealing his fate long before the final breakdown. The factory records policy of utilizing handshake agreements is often taught in music history as a quirky, rebellious anecdote. In forensic reality, it was a lethal legal loophole that facilitated gross medical negligence and relentless worker exploitation. It allowed a corporation to profit immensely from the literal destruction of a young man's brain while maintaining perfectly clean hands. The management, the producer, and the bandmates all operated safely within this constructed legal void. They built a legendary, highly profitable musical empire entirely upon the unchecked, uncompensated suffering of a legally unprotected individual. Behind the aggressive marketing of the post-punk revolution lay a stark and completely unglamorous economic reality. Despite massive critical acclaim and rising cultural influence, the independent music business model generated almost zero immediate capital for the artists. The frontman was the lead singer of the most heavily discussed band in the United Kingdom, yet he remained trapped in the working-class financial bracket. Factory records reinvested all generated revenue back into the label's eccentric projects, leaving the band members to survive on negligible gig guarantees. This severe lack of basic income forced the singer to maintain a demanding day job just to keep his house and feed his family. To pay the mortgage on his small terraced house at 77 Barton Street, he worked as a civil servant at the Macclesfield Employment Exchange. His specific governmental title was Assistant Disablement Resettlement Officer, a role that required intimate knowledge of the municipal welfare system. His daily responsibilities involved assessing the capabilities of individuals with severe physical and mental handicaps to integrate them into the local workforce. He spent his days interviewing clients with chronic illnesses, reviewing their medical files, and fighting against Bowie place discrimination on their behalf. This position created a profound, grim paradox that defined the final year of his life. Operating in this capacity, the singer possessed a highly detailed understanding of the United Kingdom's Disabled Persons Employment Act 1944. He knew exactly what legal protections a chronically ill worker was entitled to regarding safe working conditions and medical leave. He worked directly with a young female client named Corinne Lewis, who suffered from a severe, highly volatile form of epilepsy. When she unexpectedly passed away following a massive seizure, he was profoundly shaken, directly processing the event by writing the track She's Lost Control. He meticulously documented the terrifying reality of a failing nervous system long before his own diagnosis became unmanageable. The grim irony of his professional life was absolute and inescapable. He spent 40 hours a week operating as a municipal advocate for the medically vulnerable, demanding reasonable accommodations from local factory bosses. Yet when he transitioned to his role as a touring musician, he found himself entirely unable to advocate for his own basic survival. He possessed the exact bureaucratic vocabulary needed to halt his own exploitation, but the psychological grip of the entertainment machine silenced him completely. He was a recognized expert in disability rights who actively allowed a record label to work him into a state of biological collapse. This financial desperation heavily accelerated the collapse of his private domestic life, creating a multi-front psychological crisis. He was managing a newly acquired mortgage, a newborn daughter born in April 1979, and the extreme costs of his escalating medical requirements. His wife, Deborah, bore the absolute brunt of the domestic stress, acting as an unpaid, untrained medical caregiver while struggling with severe financial instability. The heavy prescription of phenobarbital drastically altered his personality type, replacing the man she married with a heavily sedated, emotionally volatile patient. The marital home in Macclesfield ceased to function as a sanctuary, transforming instead into a high-stress medical holding facility between grueling tour dates. The introduction of Annick Honoré, a Belgian journalist, into the touring dynamic further destabilized his rapidly failing psychological baseline. From an investigative perspective, this was not a standard rock and roll infidelity narrative, but a desperate attempt at extreme psychological compartmentalization. Honoré represented an entirely separate reality, a space completely disconnected from his heavy domestic responsibilities, his mortgage, and his failing marriage. More importantly, she operated outside the daily grim reality of managing a chronic, debilitating seizure disorder in a small industrial town. The frontman attempted to split his identity in two, constructing a completely unsustainable parallel life while his physical brain chemistry was actively deteriorating. Maintaining this intense level of deception required massive reserves of cognitive energy that his battered nervous system simply did not possess. The heavy barbiturates were already impairing his executive function, making it nearly impossible to navigate complex emotional conflicts or logical planning. The crushing guilt of his domestic betrayal collided violently with the severe chemical depression induced by the epilepsy medication. He was trapped between a failing marriage he could not fix, a secondary relationship he could not sustain, and a music career that was physically destroying him. The psychological pressure cooker was sealed shut, with no financial resources available to secure private psychiatric intervention or a safe medical retreat. In March 1980, the band relocated to Britannia Row Studios in London to record their second and final studio album, Closer. The sessions for this record provide the most damning forensic evidence of the collective negligence surrounding the patient. Music critics historically review Closer as a dark, atmospheric masterpiece of the post-punk genre, praising its thematic weight. However, an objective textual analysis of the vocal tracks reveals that the album functions strictly as a detailed real-time medical dossier. The lyrics are not abstract poetry, they are precise literal documentations of a human being undergoing total biological and psychological system failure. The recording sessions operated under a bizarre, heavily disconnected dynamic where the vocal delivery was entirely separated from the lyrical content. The band members focused obsessively on the technical construction of the tracks, spending hours manipulating synthesizer frequencies and drum machine patterns. They approached the studio as an industrial workshop, mechanically layering instruments without ever pausing to evaluate the severe distress broadcast through the vocal microphone. The singer was standing in the vocal booth, physically exhausted and heavily medicated, directly narrating his own impending collapse onto analog tape. The isolation between the performer and the production team was absolute, creating a vacuum where explicit cries for help were reduced to mere audio signals. A forensic examination of specific tracks obliterates any argument that his crisis was hidden or subtle. The track isolation provides a textbook psychological profile of a patient suffering from severe chemical alienation and domestic panic. He explicitly details the terror of losing his own identity to the medication, confessing his inability to function within his own home. In the track Decades, he directly addresses the immense, crushing physical burden of carrying the band's collective ambitions on his failing shoulders. These tracks do not rely on metaphor. They are direct, localized reports of a man actively drowning under the weight of industrial and medical exploitation. The failure of the surrounding collective to intercept these distress signals borders on gross negligence. Peter Hook, Bernard Sumner, and Stephen Morris were present in Britannia Row every single day, sitting just yards away behind the mixing desk. They listened to vocal take after vocal take of a man detailing his extreme isolation, his failing body, and his psychological dead ends. Yet, in subsequent decades, the surviving members universally admitted a chilling fact. They simply never bothered to listen to the words. They treated the frontman's vocal cords purely as a percussive instrument, entirely ignoring the critical data being transmitted through the lyrics. This willful deafness allowed the production machine to march forward without any ethical interruptions. If a patient walked into a psychiatric clinic and repeated the lyrics of Closer verbatim, standard medical protocol would mandate immediate involuntary hospitalization for severe risk of self-harm. In the context of a recording studio, however, these exact same statements were celebrated as highly marketable artistic intensity. The producer and the bandmates successfully extracted a brilliant vocal performance while completely ignoring the human emergency fueling it. They recorded a detailed documentation of systemic collapse, pressed it onto high-quality vinyl, and prepared to ship it to distributors. The Closer sessions firmly established that the impending disaster was neither sudden nor unforeseen by anyone paying basic attention. The patient had exhausted all available avenues of communication, laying out his entire crisis on the master tapes for his peers to evaluate. The complete lack of response from his colleagues reinforced his ultimate fatal conclusion. The machine could not be reasoned with or stopped. His medical reality, his financial ruin, and his psychological breakdown were entirely irrelevant to the operational goals of Factory Records. The system required a functional frontman to complete the upcoming Internation. All tour, and no amount of documented suffering would alter that trajectory. The illusion of the music industry dictates that the show must always go on, a mandate that treats human beings as indestructible capital. By April 1980, the biological reality of the frontman was actively colliding with the relentless momentum of Factory Records. The catastrophic breaking point occurred during the first week of April, exposing the absolute ruthlessness of the management structure. On April 7th, Ian Curtis was admitted to a hospital following an intentional overdose of his prescribed phenobarbital. This suicide attempt was the inevitable result of a patient overwhelmed by a toxic pharmaceutical regimen and profound psychological despair. In any regulated industry, a severe barbiturate overdose mandates an immediate cessation of all occupational duties. Medical protocol dictates weeks of closely monitored recovery, psychological evaluation, and a complete overhaul of the patient's chemical environment. The management of Factory Records, however, operated under a completely different set of operational priorities. Just 48 hours after his stomach was pumped in a clinical emergency ward, they ordered the singer back onto the live circuit. The band was contractually obligated to perform at Derby Hall in Barrie on April 8th, and canceling was simply not considered a viable option. The decision to force a critically unstable patient onto a stage just 2 days post-overdose is a textbook definition of corporate cruelty. The frontman was physically destroyed, his nervous system completely ravaged by the chemical shock of the heavy barbiturates. He was shoved onto the Derby Hall stage, struggling to maintain basic equilibrium under the intense scrutiny of the venue's lighting rig. His body surrendered almost immediately, managing to physically endure only 2 songs before a catastrophic collapse. The management had successfully pushed their primary asset far past the limits of human endurance, resulting in a highly public medical failure. Rather than finally pulling the plug on the operation, the management team attempted a grotesque bait and switch. They dragged the unconscious singer off stage and immediately attempted to substitute him with vocalists from the supporting acts. Alan Hempstall of Crispy Ambulance and Simon Topping of A Certain Ratio were pushed to the microphone to placate the crowd. The audience, realizing they had paid to see an authentic breakdown and were being denied the spectacle, instantly incited a violent riot. Venue security was overwhelmed, equipment was smashed, and the chaotic violence perfectly mirrored the internal destruction of the band's lead singer. The Derby Hall riot should have served as the ultimate undeniable stop sign for the entire Factory Records enterprise. It provided irrefutable physical evidence that the lead singer could no longer safely execute the basic requirements of his profession. Instead of halting the machinery, the industry doubled down, presenting the band with the ultimate commercial ultimatum. They finalized the logistics for a massive high-stakes North American tour, scheduled to depart on May 19, 1980. This transatlantic contract was universally viewed by the record label as the gateway to international stardom and massive financial leverage. For a healthy, ambitious musician, an American tour represents the pinnacle of professional achievement. For this specific patient, however, the transatlantic flight schedule represented a guaranteed, inescapable biological death sentence. He suffered from a severe phobia of flying, a psychological trigger that heavily amplified his baseline clinical depression. Furthermore, the American club circuit was notorious for grueling, unregulated travel schedules and highly aggressive strobe lighting configurations. He knew with absolute certainty that his deteriorating neural pathways would not survive the sensory and physical assault of the United States, as the pressure placed upon his shoulders during the weeks leading up to the departure date was fundamentally unmanageable. The financial future of his bandmates, his management, and the independent label itself now completely hinged on his ability to board that flight. He was trapped inside an ironclad commercial expectation, fully aware that his body was incapable of surviving the promised itinerary. To back out meant single-handedly destroying the careers of his closest peers and facing total financial ruin in his hometown. The entertainment machine had effectively cornered its prey, stripping away every possible exit strategy except one. The timeline of his final 48 hours on Earth, spanning May 17th to May 18th, 1980, reads like a forensic report of total systemic abandonment. The domestic infrastructure in Macclesfield had completely fractured under the weight of his illness and his complex infidelities. His wife, Deborah, had initiated divorce proceedings, legally formalizing the destruction of his primary domestic sanctuary. Simultaneously, The parallel life he attempted to construct on the road was collapsing under the intense pressure of his rapidly failing health. He was left completely isolated in the terraced house at 77 Barton Street, staring down the barrel of the American departure date. It is a profound failure of basic human safeguarding that a severely depressed epileptic patient was left entirely unmonitored on the eve of a transatlantic tour. Management and band members were busy packing equipment and finalizing visas, completely ignoring the massive red flags surrounding their singer. He was left alone in a silent house, heavily medicated, with unfettered access to highly negative cultural catalysts. On the evening of May 17th, he watched Werner Herzog's bleak cinematic masterpiece, Stroszek. The film acts as a grim mirror, detailing the life of a marginalized man who is systematically chewed up and destroyed by the unforgiving machinery of the American dream. The choice of viewing material was not a coincidence. It was a direct reflection of his immediate, terrifying reality. Herzog's protagonist finds himself trapped in a foreign landscape, financially ruined, and stripped of all personal agency before ultimately taking his own life. Following the film, the singer placed Iggy Pop's solo album, The Idiot, onto his turntable, letting the heavy industrial drone fill the empty house. The dark, oppressive sonic atmosphere of the record provided the final soundtrack to a mind methodically shutting down all external connections. He was not merely consuming media, he was absorbing a highly specific frequency of despair that validated his own inescapable predicament. Sometime during the early hours of Sunday, May 18th, the frontman made his final permanent decision. He utilized the physical environment of his kitchen to enact a final permanent exit. The mainstream music press has spent decades romanticizing this event as the tragic, inevitable culmination of a tortured, poetic soul. They frame his death as an artistic sacrifice, a young genius consumed by the very darkness that fueled his brilliant lyrics. This soft, poetic narrative serves only to protect the industry that actively drove him to the breaking point. An uncompromising forensic investigation demands that we strip away the poetic license and view the scene strictly through the lens of cause and effect. The final desperate action of an individual cornered by relentless industrial exploitation shatters any illusion of an abstract artistic tragedy. The patient recognized that his management would never voluntarily halt the touring machine, regardless of his physical deterioration. The record label had explicitly proven at Derby Hall that they valued the venue contract far more than his biological survival. He was strapped to a commercial vehicle heading straight off a cliff, and no one else in the vehicle was willing to hit the brakes. Under these restrictive parameters, his final act must be evaluated as a grim assertion of ultimate control. He was stripped of all legal protections, denied essential medical intervention, and treated purely as a piece of audio equipment by his producers. Taking his own life was the only unilateral action remaining that the factory records executives could not veto or commercialize in real time. By ending his life in that kitchen, he permanently severed his undocumented contract with the label and permanently canceled the North American tour. It was a brutal, extreme method of reclaiming total bodily autonomy from a system that had effectively claimed ownership of his central nervous system. The timeline confirms that the disaster was entirely preventable if basic fundamental occupational safety measures had been implemented. If the band had operated with a legal labor contract guaranteeing medical leave, The American tour could have been postponed without catastrophic financial penalties. If the management had prioritized neurology over ticket sales, the patient would have been resting in a clinical facility instead of suffocating alone in Macclesfield. The entire sequence of events is rooted in the deliberate, profit-driven decisions made by the healthy individuals surrounding the critically ill patient. The entertainment industry built the trap, locked the doors, and then successfully convinced the public that the victim simply succumbed to the romance of his own art. Within days of the physical collapse, factory records aggressively pushed the single "Love Will Tear Us Apart" to distributors. The corporate infrastructure realized maximum financial yield only after the primary human asset had been completely liquidated. The surviving members did not observe a prolonged period of operational hiatus. They immediately recruited keyboardist Gillian Gilbert, rebranded as New Order, and pivoted entirely to the highly profitable genre of synth pop. This operational shift proved to be one of the most lucrative rebranding maneuvers in modern music history. The sheer scale of the wealth generated allowed factory records to bankroll the legendary Hacienda nightclub, subsidizing an entire cultural infrastructure through the unchecked exploitation of an epileptic civil servant. The foundational handshake agreement functioned exactly as intended. It was the ultimate liability shield, allowing a company to extract maximum value from a vulnerable human being without assuming a single ounce of legal or financial responsibility. The executives and the surviving peers secured massive fortunes and international fame, proving that in the unregulated wilderness of the entertainment industry, the most profitable action a corporation can take is actively ignoring the medical dossier of its most valuable worker.